My name's Fiona Napier. I'm with the Climate Champions team, this whole webinar came about through multiple discussions with Stop Ecocide International and Nature Finance. And we're delighted to be having so many people on this webinar, which we want to be really interactive to explore Ecocide Law and its relation to finance. But I first want to pass the floor to Ambassador Jojo Maniuri, who's the ambassador for the Republic of Vanuatu, based in Belgium, who will give some opening remarks. Ambassador, over to you, sir.
Ladies and gentlemen, colleagues and friends, welcome to this important discussion. Vanuatu is one of the world's most vulnerable countries with respect to climate change and the so-called natural disaster. Earlier this year, Vanuatu was hit by 2 Category 4 cyclones in the space of a week. Since then, we have been in disaster response mode, making sure our people have their basic survival needs met. This is not normal or natural. This is a disaster of human making. Due to man-made climate change and due to fossil fuel addictions, due to the environmental destruction. Vanuatu's people are not responsible, but suffer the worst consequences. This is already the reality in the Pacific and other underdeveloped nations. But soon, this will be also the case in many other nations too. Friends, while the international community does a lot of talking, there is not enough positive action and little accountability for government and industry who continue to damage our planetary system. They do this not because they are deliberately setting out to destroy lives and livelihoods, but because the systems they are competing in are simply not fit for purpose, especially in the context of climate and ecological crisis. We do not believe in blame, but we do believe in accountability. We believe in positive change, and we believe that international law is one of the most concrete and long-lasting ways to effect the accountability and that change. Vanuatu is therefore taking a legal approach to help those governments and those industries to move forward in a way that is safe for both people and planet. There are 2 aspects to this approach. Firstly, we wanted to help government to better understand their existing obligations in the context of climate change. For this, we led a coalition of 132 countries to request a legal advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice. Our diplomatic and legal efforts in this endeavor were epic, bringing on board developed and developing nations from all geographic regions. We managed to avoid the political pitfalls that have plagued the UN climate negotiations for decades, and we have achieved what many experts and diplomatic pundits told us would be impossible. It was the first time an advisory opinion request has ever been passed by consensus in the United Nations General Assembly. Secondly, we are working to adjust the legal parameters within which finance flows and industrial practices operate in order to prevent ongoing destruction and create safety and stability into the future. In this context, Vanuatu is proud to be leading the initiative to criminalize mass harm to nature, known as ecocide. In 2019, Vanuatu became the first sovereign state to call at the International Criminal Court's annual assembly for ecocide to become the 5th crime under the Rome Statute. We have been working closely with Stop Ecocide Foundation for many years in our effort towards this goal, and we are excited to see how fast the discussion is now growing around the world. We trust that today's meeting will clarify both why this is so and also how an understanding of this legal approach framework can empower healthy decision-making in the finance community for the benefit of the entire planet, for our children, and for yours. We thank you for coming today, and we wish you fruitful discussion. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. We much appreciate you coming and speaking to us, given the leadership that your country is showing on this issue, and we certainly need leadership from states I think the approaches that Vanuatu has made on the global stage are leading the way for us and these discussions, which we hope to be of support to your initiatives. I suggest we move to Jojo Mehta, who's the Executive Director of Stop Ecocide International. Could you give us a summary of where we are at? Where is the situation now regarding ecocide law, globally and at national level, and with the system that you're working with? Jojo, over to you.
So good afternoon, good day, everybody. Thanks so much for being here. And the initiative to criminalize ecocide is one that's gaining huge traction around the world, and it's already being described as a driver and influencer of change. And along with a brief outline of progress, I'm going to put it to you that this law is not only a concrete and practical way to respond to climate and ecological crisis, but also a useful framework for strategic action in the finance sector and indeed the corporate world as a whole. Criminal law is often thought of as a framework for punishment. That is, of course, part of how it works, but that's not what it's for. Murder isn't a crime in order to punish murderers. It's a crime to stop people killing each other. Criminal law is protective law. It's what makes us safe. And the collateral damage that our economic activity has inflicted on the living world around us in recent decades, while largely unintended, is extremely dangerous. It's dangerous to climate, to nature, and to people. And as you'll be aware, we're witnessing a rising global frustration with the slow pace of action to address this danger. Yes, there are environmental regulations in place around the world, but they're often badly followed, woefully monitored, and poorly enforced. Yes, there are multilateral environmental agreements, targets, and pledges, but they're not binding. Genuine action on sustainability therefore remains an uphill struggle against a default flow of finance to business as usual. And many corporations simply don't know what to do in the face of a crisis of this scale. And this is where criminal law can be extremely useful, and ecocide law in particular. Discussion of ecocide law is now on public record in dozens of countries. Support has been logged in the Interparliamentary Union, the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, and the European Parliament, which only a couple of months ago proposed inclusion of ecocide level crimes into EU law. The International Criminal Court itself is taking developments very seriously. Events on ecocide at its annual assembly have attracted record numbers year on year. We are seeing a clear direction of travel here, and it's happening faster than we expected. So what exactly do we mean by ecocide? In 2020, our foundation convened an independent expert panel of 12 top lawyers from around the world to come up with a consensus legal definition. Chaired by renowned barrister and author Philippe Sanz-Casey and Senegalese jurist Dior Falso, the panel emerged in June 2021 with the following core text. Ecocide means unlawful or wanton acts committed with knowledge that there's a substantial likelihood of severe and either widespread or long-term damage to the environment being caused by those acts. And this definition has rapidly become the starting point for political discussions worldwide, and indeed it has much to recommend it. Firstly, it's based on consequences, on the result or threatened result of an act, not on a particular behavior or list of behaviors. And this is important because it doesn't target any specific industry, but instead refers to the severity of actual or threatened harm. It thus remains relevant over time and makes intuitive sense. Secondly, it strongly reinforces existing laws. A board of directors will approach its environmental obligations differently, knowing that if it fails to fulfill them and threatens ecocide as a result, its members could be in criminal law territory. This will be a huge step for accountability, improving adherence to existing and future regulatory frameworks, and changing decision-making and the approach to due diligence in a very positive way. Thirdly, it creates a useful lens for anyone that knows their sector through which to consider their activities, and if need be, to address strategic positive change. It prompts specific and useful questions. And that is gold dust, because the miracle of our human brains is that when presented with questions, we have a habit of finding answers. It's unreasonable to expect policymakers to know what each economic sector should do to become sustainable. It's eminently sensible, on the other hand, to give the experts within those sectors the framework they need to work it out. Indeed, it is often those in the corporate and investment world who understand that the power of this law begins not when the law is adopted, but much earlier. Because the time between now and the adoption of the law, which could be any time from 2025 and certainly before 2030, is the window for strategic positive change and for identifying safe investments. Of course, I mean safe financially, but I also mean safe in the real world, which is to say, least likely to destroy the ecosystem upon which we wholly depend. And let's not lose sight of that. This is a real world solution to a real world problem. We spent hundreds of years treating nature as an infinite bank of resources, and we have hit a harsh reality check. And as I hope I've made clear, Ecocide Law is an eminently logical, necessary, and positive response to this. It's about deterring dangerous behavior, and it's about protecting life. And I think we can all agree that that's worth doing. I'm very much looking forward to today's discussions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jojo, for those opening remarks and also context setter with some really useful updates. Thank you. I now want to pass to Domingo Pais, who's a representative of Ecuador's Achua people and the Indigenous Territories Coordinator for the Sacred Headwaters Initiative in the Amazon. He's going to speak in Spanish and will be translated by Rafaela. Domingo, over to you, please.
Hola, buenos días. Saludar primeramente a las organizadoras y agradecer también por este tiempo que nos dan la oportunidad a los pueblos indígenas.
Good morning with everybody. Before anything, I want to say thank you with the organizers to provide this space for Indigenous communities.
Es muy importante hablar este punto de ecocidio. Yo más bien voy a centrarme a nuestra realidad. Los pueblos indígenas históricamente conocemos la importancia y la vida del mundo natural.
It's very important to speak about ecocide. And today I want to center my intervention in our reality. Historically, Indigenous communities understand the importance of nature.
Para nosotros, la naturaleza es un ser vivo. Todo el ecosistema es un ser vivo. Somos parte de ello. Nosotros somos naturaleza y vivimos de la naturaleza. Nos convivimos con la naturaleza.
For us, nature is a living being. The world, the whole ecosystem is a living being, and we're a part of it. We are nature, and we coexist with nature.
Todo el río es un ser vivo. Los árboles son vivos, tienen su espíritu. Nosotros tenemos una conexión del mundo natural. Nos convivimos. Tienen su derecho. Todo ese ecosistema están seres vivientes indecibles.
The entire river is a living being. Trees are alive and they have spirits. They have rights, and the whole ecosystem has rights to be there. And they are visible and also invisible beings there.
Ante eso hemos exigido al Estado, y por suerte en nuestro país se reformó el Estado ecuatoriano, la Constitución. El derecho de la naturaleza está aprobado, pero en la práctica nadie cumple nada.
We have asked the state, and thankfully in our country of Ecuador, the Constitution was rewritten in 2018, and we have the rights of nature within the Constitution, but in practice, none of that is being respected.
Entonces nosotros ahora proponemos esa verdadera transición. En la transición ecológica es transición humana, o sea, es el cambio que tenemos que hacer nosotros los humanos en nuestra forma de pensar.
So now we propose the real transition, an ecological and human transition, which is a change that we need to do in the way that we as humans think.
Es muy importante entre todos los que estamos liderando, ustedes, las que están en luchando sobre ecocidio, los pueblos indígenas y otros instantes, unirnos para crear la conciencia humana. Eso es importantísimo en la sociedad.
It's very important now for all of us to get together, to collaborate, to work together, to really create a new human consciousness, to change the way in which we do things.
Empresarios, agricultores, indígenas, no indígenas, hombres, mujeres, jóvenes, tenemos que ya cambiar el sistema de vida organizada de miles de años. Es hora de tocar con acciones.
Business people, women, youth, men, we all need to get together to change this and change it from the roots.
Entonces, felicitar y este trabajo que están llevando, invitarles también que sigamos tejiendo más alianza, porque el propósito único del cambio climático es la corresponsabilidad de todos.
So I want to congratulate this work. I want to invite everybody to continue weaving this alliance because we are all co-responsible for this change and for the future.
La acción es importante. Acción es actuar desde ya, no esperar la ley. Está bien que articulemos una ley para que los que destruyan sean penados muy fuertemente, pero sí tenemos que comenzar en la práctica, en la acción. Eso es mi llamado, por favor.
Action is important. We need to act now. We can't wait for the laws. It's great to create laws so that people who are responsible are held accountable. But my call today is to start acting now.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Domingo. I know many in the call are profoundly affected by what you have said, and we heed your call to act now. Where we had planned to go was to hear from Bob Walker of ICGN, who's the head of sustainability of the International Corporate Governance Network. And he's agreed to speak. He's actually speaking on video with an interview with Jojo, just addressing why this membership body finds ecocide so important and their role in criminalizing ecocide.
I'm not sure how much of a background story you want, but just by way of background, I might mention that ICGN was started up in 1995 by global investment institutions with the goal of raising corporate governance standards around the world. And really that focus continued until about 1995, until about 2005, when issues related to the environment, human rights began to creep onto the agenda. And since that time, over the past 10 years in particular, those issues have now leapt to the top of the investor agenda. Biodiversity, as you might expect, along with climate change, are at that very top of the list of priorities, of areas of profound risk, areas that bring risk not just to individual companies or portfolios, but to the economic system. I think investors have finally begun to figure out that nature is material, life is material to investment decision-making, and that these issues present profound risks to our ability to deliver long-term sustainable value for our clients. But ICGN put out a paper earlier this year to identify 10 game changers that can help bring biodiversity, make it real for investors, and provide avenues by which they can begin to take action. Ecocide is one of those game changers. We're at the stage now, and it won't be a surprise to you, Jojo, or to many people in this space, that the risks are profound and they're coming more and more rapidly. I'm here in Canada, the province of Alberta last week was on fire. This week it's Nova Scotia. The risks are huge. The impact on large populations in terms of air quality are visible. So these risks have come up, and I think the role of Ecocide should be to sharpen the picture even further for corporations, for investors, and for boards of directors that govern both sets of institutions. Ecocide will clarify the mind and help make this issue even more profound, even more material to people who aren't quite at the table yet, but who need to be. Yeah, I think investors like clarity and corporations like clarity. You know, where can we go? What's no go? And there's a question of whether they can accept that. But they do like clarity. They do want rules. They do want laws. They do want systems in place that can help clarify the decision-making process. Investing is not an easy game. There are lots of variables at play. And if investors know that there are certain no-go areas, there are certain no-go activities, that can help, again, clarify and make clear where we need to go and where we can't in terms of protecting biodiversity and restoring nature.
Wise words from Bob Walker, and we thank him for his time, giving us the perspectives from the corporate sector. We have one more speaker, my former boss, Gonzalo Munoz, who's the former climate champion of COP25. Gonzalo, you've played a leading role in creating Race to Zero, Race to Resilience, and are a business leader in your own right. So can you give us a few words about how business can exert its competitiveness and best thinking to lead efforts to make sure we protect nature? Over to you, Gonzalo.
Thanks so much, Fiona, and thanks for stopping Ecocide to put us together in such a relevant and urgent topic. I hope that you can hear me well. Then I would love to just continue, as we just heard from Rob, the importance of the shifts that we are perceiving when it comes to the role of the private sector. On one side, as he properly mentioned, I would say that businesses are waking up to the reality that we all depend on nature. We all depend on a thriving ecosystem, thriving ecosystem that will allow us to not only continue progressing, let's say, but improve the way we progress, improve the way we understand development and success as a species. What we have seen when it comes to the business sector is not only that the understanding of materiality has changed, and we see that not only climate and biodiversity and water are now positioning right in the front and in the center of what materiality means for businesses, but also I'm today speaking from the UNESCO headquarters in Paris, where we are holding the second negotiation meeting for a global treaty to end plastic pollution. There are some other aspects that are totally related on how businesses have been evolving in the last century that now are clearly wrong and require a new understanding of what, as I said, progress means. What is this proposing, right? New business models. Companies all around the world are understanding that there's no way to consider business success where you your business model might be creating damage in the environment and even, of course, damaging the social grid and the social connections all around the world. The value chain must be much more centered in how businesses are considering their impact. It's not only about what a particular business is doing. Most of them, mostly considering the big businesses, are so much interlinked with many other businesses all around the world, and now they know that they have to take a much more consideration upstream in their value chain. The corporate structure is being forced to understand these particularities. We need a new mindset when it comes to who runs the business, who is running the rules of the game, and hopefully mostly who defines what are the metrics that will reward all of the employees in a certain business. But then it also comes to the role of talent. Is changing dramatically, and I would say beautifully. Nowadays, young people are asking for their values to be represented in the companies where they work. And finally, of course, the role of finance is absolutely fundamental, that money moves the incentives of the companies in a way that will not only protect nature, but also restore some of the ecosystemical services that we require. In that sense, what we have done with the brilliant team where you still work, Fiona, was first launch the Race to Zero as a way to work on mitigation of the climate the climate complexities that we are confronting and the climate emergency that we're confronting in all around the world. Then the Race to Resilience to protect the lives and the livelihoods of 4 billion people all around the world that are suffering the consequences of the climate crisis. It's mostly women and girls from the most vulnerable communities around the world that, of course, we know that they had no responsibility whatsoever of creating this crisis, but they're suffering the hardest consequences of it. And then the Glasgow Financial Alliance to Net Zero that is mobilizing many of the means of implementation that we required to implement such a treaty. Those campaigns are based in the logic of what we call the 4 Ps. Every company connected to the campaigns is pledging according to the rules that we have defined at the UN by the high-level champions and many other entities that are regulating this, and that pledge is increasing its requirements. Then we have to plan according to science, validated by science. Then we have to proceed. We have to start moving. Fourth, we have to publish at least once per year. And finally, I would say the 5th P that I think connects us very well to the topic of today is that we have to persuade, we have to work on policy metrics. We have now to move from voluntarism to regulation. That's the place where we are, and that are also the expectations of what we expect to happen when it comes to the biodiversity framework and therefore the coming Montreal framework, but also in this treaty that I'm working and we're working on and where I'm speaking from, the plastic treaty that should expect to be one in which the businesses are not only mobilizing on a voluntary basis, but also promoting regulation that will play in the field towards, again, not only stopping the damage that we are creating around the world, but also start really restoring all of the ecosystemical services that we have lost. Thank you very much, Fiona, again. Also thanks to you, Jojo, for the invitation, and look forward to continue collaborating. Back to you.
Thank you very much, Gonzalo. That's a real rallying cry, and also noted the role of talent, the role of leadership in this endeavour, but the importance of regulation. I'm going to change the agenda a little bit and ask Christopher Bartlett from the Republic of Vanuatu, the Climate Diplomacy Trade Advisor, to speak to us about what it means to act now at a global level. Because Christopher's been called away to help his government with some matters, so he can't join until later. And then we'll come to the deep dive. Christopher, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much, Fiona, and thank you also to Domingo for those incredibly relevant remarks. And this is absolutely a crisis that involves all of us. What we are doing to our planet does not distinguish between governments or indigenous people, corporations, or civil society. And that's exactly what I think Ecocide Law is trying to accomplish, is to unify the response to this crisis that we're all facing. Vanuatu, like so many of us, is out of time. I mean, what the climate crisis has done in terms of the cyclones that you heard our ambassador talk about before, what's happening to the coral reefs with ocean acidification, the salinization of our groundwater sources, and of course, sea level rise, means that our very existence is threatened. And this is, by definition, an example of the type of crime that we'd like to see Ecocide cover. The science is clear that there are specific acts by states, by corporations, that are causing the climate impacts, the loss and damage that we're experiencing. And that's exactly the kind of crime that needs to be acknowledged by all, recognized by all, and prevented by the actions of all. As we heard at the beginning, it's not about punishing actors, it's about preventing this from occurring in the first place. We can't save an island that has been submerged. We can prevent the submerging in the first place. What Vanuatu is really trying to do is to approach international law with a very collective spirit. We understand that really the only thing that holds different countries with very different contexts, different stakeholders together, is an agreement to play by the same rules. And that process is actually an incredibly constructive process that Vanuatu found as we amassed a coalition of 132 countries to co-sponsor our resolution to bring climate change to the International Court of Justice. And we didn't pitch this or in fact intend this to be any kind of contentious finger pointing or you've done this, you owe that, but rather international law could be an approach where we all agree on the same set of actions and appropriate behaviors. And that's really quite unifying. There's no one that's preferred over anybody else. There's no one that gets extra credit or no one gets a pass, but all states are required to do as much as possible to prevent the kind of environmental harm and climate harm that we're experiencing. And that also applies to finance, the topic of this discussion. Vanuatu is actually putting incredible amounts of our own budgetary resources into addressing climate change. In fact, this year, 2023, the government has allocated 15% of our fiscal space to addressing vulnerability and building resilience. Now, that is a huge investment. And it's our view that every state needs to be taking that level of ambition when we talk about mobilizing finance, not only states, but corporations and other actors. And this is what a shared set of values, a shared set of rules can accomplish if we do this in international law. It's so exciting to hear about what's happening with the plastic treaty. Again, it's states with different views and different levels of development agreeing on a set of rules for an endpoint that we want, which is a plastic-free future. Similarly, Vanuatu is working on a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty, not to punish fossil fuel producers, but to set that endpoint where we don't need to depend on fossil fuels. And Ecocide, of course, is setting that endpoint of an Earth that's free of this environmental destruction, which we all can agree on. So Vanuatu's approach is very much one of collaboration, working together, and we're so excited to be spearheading this initiative with a range of countries and partners. And thanks so much to the Stop Ecocide Foundation and to the other colleagues, the Nature Finance on this call. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Christopher. And to the point of this requires all actors, I want to pass to Marcelo Furtado, who's a principal at Nature Finance and previously director of Greenpeace, to speak to us about the issue of corporate supply chains. So we're starting the deep dive now, and I want to make this much more interactive. We've had a number of sort of talking heads, very useful expertise shared, but the purpose of this deep dive is to explore some issues in depth. So Marcelo is going to speak to global corporate supply chains, and then we want to open the floor for engagement. Put your comments in the chat, please, or put your hand up if you'd like to say something. And then we will, after that discussion, we will come to the role of finance. And then we will go to new models. Marcelo, over to you. Tell us about corporate supply chains.
Thank you so much, Fiona, and thank you for all the participants. I have to say, I'm particularly pleased to see many of longtime friends here. Domingo, Satosa, Marita. It's so nice to be here with you. I would like to start the dialogue, Fiona, by reminding ourselves of something that has not been mentioned, which is the most recent IPCC report indicating that we have less than 50% chances to meet 1.5 degrees, which brings an essence of urgency that Domingo was calling us for, and which drives us to the question of, it was said that we need, and the business sector likes clarity, rules, and process. And it doesn't seem to me that we lack neither clarity, rules, or process. What we're lacking is the implementation of those and followership of those. And therefore, what turns out to be quite pivotal for us is to look on what it means to operate with traceability, transparency, and accountability. Because that is what will show us if indeed we are playing by the rules, the process, and the clarity that we have already. I think Gonzalo raised a very important point, framing that we're moving from voluntary to regulatory frameworks. And also Christopher was bringing up the importance of law, the rule of law for this. But the truth is, we have many, many cases of wonderful laws being written and not necessarily being implemented. And then comes the point of what do we need to do to implement properly behavior? And I think that that is something that requires advocacy. Advocacy from governments that is not only about designing the law, but implementing it and committing to its implementation. It's about advocacy from society at large, functioning not only as a watchdog, but as an enabler of saying what is acceptable, what is not acceptable, and particularly advocacy from the private sector and the finance sector, directing the investments on the solutions and on the positive outcomes. Nature finance vision is to align global finance with climate, nature, positive and equitable outcomes. And to do that, we part from the principle of what was said here, that 100% of the economy is 100% dependent on nature. But at the end of the day, it also means governance. It means how we decide to govern our stakeholders, our chains. One example, to go to your provocation on the how do we do this in the real economy, I think it's an example of what we're now engaging with on the illegal gold mining issue in the Brazilian Amazon. We have the public outrage from not only Brazilian society, but also global society, saying it's absolutely unacceptable to see environmental destruction, human rights abuse associated to an economic practice of illegal gold extraction that suddenly finds itself merged into the legal market and therefore being used either as a metal in the industry or as an asset class in the financial sector. So that begs the question, what one can do to ensure that we eradicate the illegal gold mining from the market. And for that comes, again, the importance of government advocacy, society advocacy, and the finance and private sector advocacy. In this specific case, what we saw is with the change of government in Brazil, We saw a change on how the Brazilian government is looking and making efforts on this. So starting already last year, but moreover gaining speed and scale this year, we see the federal police engagement on traceability. We see the tax authority looking at electronic invoicing together with the central bank. We see society engaging, particularly with NGOs and academia engaging, building traceability frameworks, traceability tools that can be applied. And then we're seeing a reaction, a positive reaction from finance sector, not only welcoming those tools, but actually considering still on a voluntary basis to apply those tools and use those tools when investing on the issue. But the interesting point is the way this started, at least for the nature finance engagement, was because we invited Neidinha Chai and Kim Surui to go to a business finance meeting in Geneva. And Switzerland is the #1 purchaser of gold in the planet, in order to not only speak about this, but also showcase their film, The Territory. And one could imagine that that would be taken as a provocation, and business will say, well, we would like to be doing the right thing, but it's complicated. And yet the result we got was absolutely the opposite. We had 800 people applauding, standing up to what the speech of Neidinha carried. And the main message was, the time of ignorance is over. This is the time of traceability. This is the time of transparency. This is the time of accountability. And at the same time, the provocation of what are you prepared to do? So with that and the engagement of the private sector through the Brazilian Mining Association, you got also the business sector engagement. This was supposed to end with a nice happy end, where I could say that by the end of the year, we'll have a celebration of full traceability and a commitment from the financial sector. But just yesterday, the Brazilian Congress passed legislation that goes against the demarcation of indigenous lands in Brazil. And now one can say, but wait a minute, Marcelo, what is the noise here? Because you're telling such a nice story of one example of a very drastic nature market, an illegal market that is moving towards being made accountable and changing the way government, society, and private sector engages. And it shows that the accountability we need and the civil society engagement and the society at large engagement we need goes, goes beyond one or other example and lies on the foundation of society defining that we need to be nature positive, climate positive, and equitable as a society. And because we don't have yet that situation, we see situations like the one in the Congress yesterday, reversing a legislation and putting at threat the very same Amazon rainforest that we're trying to save with this case. So I think legislation like the Ecocide Law plays a pivotal role, needs to be integrated to other existing pieces of legislation, such as anti-money laundering legislation and so on, to add efficiency. But ultimately, we need to encourage advocacy from all key stakeholders. And the essence for market change and sectoral change in the entire supply chain is the engagement towards making sure that we have clarity that unless we have a nature positive, a climate positive, and an equitable planet, we have no future. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcelo. That was incredibly powerful exhortation for why we need a law like Ecocide, which applies universally across all jurisdictions, which could help provide challenges towards national Congress decisions, such as the one that you've just shared. I'm not seeing any hands in the chat, but I want to explore this issue a bit by going to Alec van Verenberg, who's a partner in the corporate law firm DLA Piper. Alec, in your view, you're involved in corporate law. What are some of the instruments that civil society and companies could draw on that would help in the protection of natural assets being mined illegally by corporates and through other supply chain and commodity chains?
Oh, and thank you, Fiona, and thanks, for this very interesting event. I think I want to actually very much echo some of the elements that that Marcelo has raised, and which really I think speak to the necessary need to complete the puzzle and to make sure that we address this from an integrated perspective. One element, of course, is the advocacy, which must really be there to create the political will to go further. But I think there's an interesting combination that we see nowadays of both of technology, of regulation, and then of an element closing the loop, which very well needs to be this ecocide definition applying globally. I think right now the knowledge defense, which used to be very much an excuse for inaction in the corporate world, is no longer available. We have the geolocation tools, we have DNA analysis, we have all of the aspects which really allow us to enforce, and which also allows the corporate sector to better control what is happening and to detect any practices which are harmful and remedy them. If we then combine that with regulation, which also creates necessary transparency, so that also this can be broadly controlled by public authorities and by civil society, such as the EU is currently now doing with the EU deforestation regulation. Hopefully that will be fully adopted soon, the corporate sustainability disclosure, the disclosure regulation, also creating those requirements to put all the transparency forward so that also this can be checked and accountability can be raised there. I think this is important. This creates almost a push for the corporate sector to really act proactively and to really not wait for public authorities, which are always inevitably are a bit slower to go there, and to make sure that they can clean up their act before most harmful practices occur. But then that loop can only be closed if there is also the stick. And I think the ecocide definition is really important to that respect, to know that when you have, for instance, in the EU deforestation regulation, you have this due diligence requirement and so on. I mean, it's all very nice to have due diligence, to have transparency, but also you need to be what we started with Jojo, which indicated in the beginning, the deterring effect from having the criminalization, the fact that you will be held fully accountable if you are effectively polluting or harming ecosystems, is really important. So I think we need to very clearly watch these three elements put together. I would maybe, besides from advocacy, add another element, of course, that we need also to be careful and to think of some flanking measures, because of course, when you're talking about geolocation, we're talking about disclosure, about reporting, this may also be very much available to some of our large corporate clients, but we also need to be concerned about the smallholders, about the local communities, and also them. I mean, subjecting them to ever more regulation, ever more practices is also something which could be a little bit of counterproductive, and which risks to creating a lot of burdens on them. But I think and I think the EU has starting to understand this, there also needs to be flanking measures, technical assistance, given the EU deforestation regulation provides for this, says that it will assist with technical assistance there for smallholders, but also apply a bit of a community approach to making sure that when some of the most harmful practices are fortunately being abandoned, that this also goes together with community work, and which provides for just transition elements also across the international communities, I think, which are affected by this, is also going to be very important. It's something which may be overlooked, and I would just have a call to also raise the interest on that point.
Yeah, thank you very much, Alec. That's one thing that's coming through, certainly from discussions and experience of several organizations, which is, it's one thing addressing illegal activity down corporate supply chains, but you have to think of the displacement of what happens to that activity, how that affects smallholders and poor people's lives. And indeed, as Marcelo was explaining on another call, the implications for organized crime as well, and where some of that illicit commodities go as well. But just sticking with the interaction between an international framework regarding ecocide and national and regional frameworks, I want to invite James Gondy, who's the Stop Ecocide International's regional coordinator in Africa, to just tell us about some other regional frameworks that exist that could address environmental protection and ecocide in Africa. James, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, participants. Thank you, Fiona, Stop Ecocide International. Basically, as we speak of Africa, there isn't yet a uniform regional framework for the criminalization of environmental harm. And the fact that we're campaigning for the adoption of ecocide by African states would introduce into efforts to have green growth and to have climate smart economies would invigorate that particular effort to have respect for sustainable development goals and our obligations to climate change and climate protection treaties. Now, when it comes to the subject of finance, there's a big effort towards greening finance in Africa because we came here today to discuss finance. Now, the African Development Bank is at the forefront of the Greening Finance Initiative. And what this seeks to do is incentivize businesses, corporates, private equity companies, pension funds, and so on, to pursue business models and to finance initiatives that promote the protection of livelihoods, but also sustainable use of natural resources and improve food security and energy security as well in the context of a healthy energy mix. Now, it is recognized by the Africa Green Growth Initiative and African Green Growth Architecture that in order to preserve biodiversity in Africa, there would need to be a radical shift and change in the way that we protect our natural resources. The first port of call has always been to abide by environmental law and to establish national legislation and mechanisms for enforcing international environmental law. Now, if you go to any country in Africa, you will find most countries have an Environmental Management and Coordination Act. And what that does, what pieces of legislation do, really is to proscribe certain types of pollution and destruction of ecosystems, waterways, and so on and so forth. But there are solutions that have come in to incentivize even financial sector actors to finance businesses and finance corporate ventures that respect the environment and that uphold environmental law and environmental standards. So for example, the African Development Bank is now issuing green bonds. It's issuing sustainable bonds, social bonds, and other incentivized, very innovative financial products to the market, to businesses, and encouraging them to invest in climate smart businesses, including climate smart agriculture, for example, that has and industries that have least impact on the environment. So we see an effort in Africa towards the greening of industries, led largely by the financing initiatives of the African Development Bank. So as a result, we've seen many coalitions develop around this. There's the Africa Green Finance Coalition that came out of the COP26 discussions. In Zambia, we have the capital markets, which have adopted a green finance policy as central to meeting Zambia's development initiatives. The same applies to Morocco, which is seeking to develop a green economy. So we have as well the Africa Green Bank Initiative that is trying as much as possible to incentivize businesses to adopt climate smart policies, climate smart businesses, and climate smart financing. So it is in this regard that we consider that the introduction of further proscription of environmental harm on a widespread scale that would have long-term damage to ecosystems and biodiversity through the introduction of a law called Ecocide would raise that bar, would further incentivize corporates and financial institutions to look first at the protection of the environment when starting businesses and when financing projects, so that we have projects that are financed that are ethical in nature and respect environmental protection. Thank you very much.
That's great, James. Thank you very much. And it's a very good segue for us to go into exploring in a bit more detail the role of finance. You were talking about finance and the role particularly of MDBs and kind of public finance to help make sure that finance is flowing towards nature protection than towards nature harm. And I also want to alert people on the group that there's another interesting network that started called the Africa Natural Capital Alliance, which is a grouping of banks, insurance companies and others, African banks, insurance companies and others on the continent who are seeking to inform themselves of forthcoming frameworks like the TNFD and how they can engage with those to make sure that they're managing their risk exposure appropriately. So I want us now to move on to exploring the role of finance. James, you've helped greatly in taking us to do that. One thing we know, for example, is that companies are 2.3 times more likely to report on their risks and how their impacts on water, land, and other ecosystems if required by financial institutions to do so. And of course, finance flows across supply chains, across portfolios, and across jurisdictions. And certainly we know in Climate Champions, as Gonzalo was saying, if you can start changing the financial system, then you have a chance to change the way we are operating and the way society is engaging with nature, as well as hearing from important voices such as Indigenous peoples and others who are intimately involved with nature and the natural world. So I want to invite Ekaterina Turskin, who's the director of CITIC Capital, the ESG group. Kat, you're director of an investment company working across a number of different portfolios. Do financial firms consider Ecocide an area they should be concerned with? How would an investment company protect itself from the risk that it was supporting Ecocide? And what tools, what frameworks are you currently using to help CITIC navigate this system? Over to you, Kat.
Yeah, so thank you very much, Fiona, and thank you everybody who's spoken. I think a lot of important points have been raised, so I'll try to build off of that. So as far as CITIC is concerned, or our team in particular, we certainly focus on sustainability and sustainability-led investment. And so I think there are, a number of important things that we take into consideration when making an investment, right? So we certainly look at the supply chain. We certainly look at the environmental impacts of what we're doing and what our portfolio companies are doing. But we are, I would say, in particular, we have a focus on ESG and sustainability, right? And there are also a number of impact-focused funds. But maybe just taking a step back a little bit, I would also note that there are a lot of funds that are not, or a lot of investment professionals that are not focused on that. And in the US, we also have a very big debate, pushing in the exact opposite direction and saying we should absolutely not be thinking about sustainability or ESG. And so I think, there are a couple of things that maybe are important just broadly in terms of getting alignment from the financial sector. You have incentives and you have disincentives, right? And I think the incentives are clearly there from, subsidies to invest in environmental technologies and renewables. You also have incentives by large financial institutions, like BlackRock, for example, who have, over the past couple of years sort of made it a point to bring ESG frameworks and project reviews to the forefront of their investment decisions, in order to sort of, I would say, BlackRock being one of the largest asset managers, bringing capital away from other fund managers that don't necessarily focus on those things, right? By saying we focus on this, we think it's important, and sort of setting a standard for others to follow. But I also think disincentives are very important. I think, I was just at a conference where they're saying that ESG funds underperform your traditional, private equity or hedge funds. And I think the reason for that is clearly you don't have enough economic disincentives, because you have a lot of companies that can continue to pollute or continue to essentially benefit off of what is ecocide, because there are no financial penalties to them for doing so. And there are no financial penalties to the financial manager for doing that. And so I think, the question of ecocide, one of the speakers earlier mentioned that it's important that it is an international framework. And I think that's because, this enables countries or stakeholders from other parts of the world to, bring claim against companies, but also investors that aren't taking the ecocide or environmental and social considerations into account when they're making their financial decisions, right? Because unfortunately in the US, this is still a topic for debate. But if you have other countries that can, if you have a US company operating in Europe or in Latin America or in Africa that is clearly breaking these rules, you have other ways to approach them and to hold them accountable. And I think truly it has to be financial accountability. That's the only way that investors will truly be motivated to change their behavior. I think, of course, there are companies that have sort of, matured and respect the importance of environmental sustainability and of, preventing ecocide. But that's still, I would say, more in the minority. And I think the tools that we use, of course, there's been a lot of discussion around regulation and transparency. So, and Fiona, to your point, if, portfolio companies, but also we as the financial institution are required to report and monitor our portfolio companies to say how they're performing, what their supply chain looks like, providing that kind of level of transparency. I think that's very important. And I think it also sets a bar, right? For example, the European Union issued SFDR principles like Article 8 and Article 9 that are really focused on encouraging funds that take sustainability into consideration or even make it part of their thesis, right? Investment mandate. And that's bringing money to those investors, right? And incentivizing them from the positive, right? That we only want to give money to investors that are taking things like this into consideration, that are going to be mindful of whether their portfolio companies are causing ecocide and, other harms. So I think those are, ultimately does come down to regulation. I think the only way to truly punish, on a broad scale or incentivize on a broad scale is through government regulation. And the more broadly you can make it, or the more unified you can make it in an international framework, the stronger it is. So.
Thanks, Kat. Really powerful, really clear, really straightforward, and much appreciate that. And of course, notice that the EU deforestation regulation actually doesn't apply to investors and finance institutions. So I wanted to pass to Matthew Donsell of Nature Finance, because you've been looking at what are the kinds of approaches that could operate across countries, across portfolios, that could help alert while we wait and prepare for Ecocide Law to come, that could help alert finance institutions to the nature risks that they're facing? Over to you, Matthew. Absolutely.
Great to be here. Thanks everyone for coming along. Yeah, so I just think I'd like to, and this will partly touch on what Alex and Marcelo have also spoken of, is that we need to maybe approach this in sort of, how does the EU's offense of Ecocide really stretch out outside of the EU and into other jurisdictions that might be within the supply chains going into the EU? We look at the deforestation regulation, which is pretty good. It's great. It expands from timber to deforestation related products such as beef and leather, soya, cocoa. But at the same time, we have 14 countries who are supplier countries arguing that it puts an unfair onus on them on how to, as Alec had mentioned, sort of on the traceability issues and sort of the extra costs that it will affect them in having to, supply a proper nature positive product. So then we need to look at Ecocide and whether the risk of that crime going to the financial institutions might drive them to inequitably pull away from these developing countries and the markets that are there. Sorry if this is a very roundabout way of saying, but yes, I am looking at how this spreads out internationally, and really we also need to be aware that while it's good, could be very good for nature, it needs to be both good for nature and people hand in hand. And I suppose the only other point I may have, and just a question to put to the floor and to Ekaterina, but do you think that this will drive the adoption of natural capital accounting, which I see as a bridge between the impacts on nature and the actual balance sheet of companies? So yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Matthew. Let's take it to the floor. Chidi, would you like to please address Matthew's question and also speak to us about how you do see these multitude frameworks interacting? Where do you foresee this system going shortly? You're on the advisory expert panel for the SBTI. You've just joined it. You've got a big background in green finance. We'd love to hear from you, from your vantage point. How can we work with these frameworks to ensure nature finance flows in the right directions?
Thanks very much for that, Fiona. Just to contextualize what you just said. So I joined SBTI's technical advisory group a few months ago, and I've just been promoted or moved on to their expert advisory group. There are lots of acronyms to come, of course, but the TNFD is where you'd really start. The Task Force on Nature-related Financial Disclosure, whose closing date for consultation is tomorrow, publishing in October, will be telling us in detail what they think that corporates and financial institutions should be disclosing on their balance sheets to show us exactly what their nature impact is. As far as most financial institutions are concerned and companies are concerned, this is the cutting edge of the debate. This is where we're at, because people need to know in a graded way what their biodiversity impact is and their operations, both in a scope 1 sense, what their utilities do in a scope 2 sense, and what their entire value chain represents in a scope 3 sense. But I think the value that Stop Ecocide International bring to the debate for finance is that it provides a floor, an absolute floor, below which companies know they should not fall. The intentional degradation and damage to large ecosystems as an international crime is a game changer. And of course, I know I'm preaching to the choir when I say that we do need to change the game, because we're in a position of such massive market failure that last year I served as a senior research fellow for green finance at the Drawdown Institution. We estimated over there that 12% of the anthropogenic change that occurs on this planet every year, 12% of humanity's carbon footprint comes from deforestation. Now, you might not realize just how big that is until you realize that 11% of humanity's carbon footprint comes from the US economy. So ecocide, either by intent or by accident, in the destruction of megaflora, is driving 12% of our push towards dangerous tipping points in the way that our planet lives. So within the context of understanding the danger that we're in, the climate emergency that we're in, understanding the disclosure requirements of firms, that this idea of having a consistent and clear criminal definition of how firms should not act is profoundly valuable. Now, within the context of broader financial engineering, how firms act, how directors behave, what the consequences are, there's the fact that for years, whenever damage is done, directors who are held responsible in my jurisdiction, here in the UK, for example, can take out directors and officers insurance. You can be insured so that if you do any damage, you can pay back some money, and it might take years to recover, but you're financially covered. Well, if we have widespread global adoption of ecocide as a crime, this safety net is also removed because insurance cannot insure you against criminal activity. So once again, the implications are that risk management has to become far clearer, far sharper. Corporate disclosure has to sit above broad ecocide damage. And as far as accounting principles are concerned, nature capital or any other version thereof, the issue of the value of public goods, such as clean air and clean water as provided by nature, is very contentious. What's not contentious is that large-scale damage, however you account for it, is completely unacceptable. I think that's what I want to emphasize within this. I think, you know, I have an accounting and banking background. I do tend to be really interested in the minutiae of management, but I think that the crimes of ecocide are binary. They do set, you know, lines, red lines against we shouldn't cross. I think that creates a lot of value for all the participants in financial markets going forward. That's the contribution I'd like to make. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Judy. Very, very helpful, because certainly there are, you know, there's a question for any other corporate lawyers on this webinar, is to what extent, you know, is disclosure and going through potentially tick box exercises a useful way of approaching this versus having obviously a clear, if you like, containment situation where ecocide gives you the boundaries of what is absolutely not permissible. That's super helpful. Does anyone have any questions for Chidi? Please raise your hand, or any comments. Marcelo, please.
Sorry, just because I have to leave shortly, I wanted to make a comment and maybe a question, Chidi, because I really like the way you framed the conversation. I just feel that we have to understand that the solution lies on building a nature positive and climate positive economy. So as much as we want to stop what is wrong, there is a question about how do we build what is right. And in the illegal gold mining case, the big question floating here in Brazil is, so what do you do with all these people that are in horrible conditions put to work on these illegal nature industry and create a bioeconomy in the Amazon that is one that can flourish, generate jobs, income, and also positive outcomes for climate and nature. When we think about all the discussion, for example, that we're exploring on our task force on nature markets, which by the way, will disclose its recommendations and now in early August during the Amazon Summit, there is a question about what is the role for nature markets, be it the agricultural commodities or carbon markets or biodiversity credits and so on, and how can one do it and govern it in a way where the people that are most responsible for keeping the forest standing can participate on the positive outcomes of it. Also respecting the boundaries that are set if there is an understanding that this should not be incorporated into a financial market, or this is sacred land that should be off limits. And we have today technology that allows one to respect that and promote that positively. So I think I'm just trying to turn the conversation also to the positive side of, in trying to find solutions, there are incredible opportunities. But if we repeat the same mistakes we've made in shaping our original economy, then we're set to failure.
100%, 100%. Thank you for that question. That was an excellent question. There are lots of mechanisms by which the global economy is trying to deal with ecocidal businesses or business models that are ecocidal, such as the ones you talk about, where indigenous lands are being invaded by unscrupulous miners who use dangerous chemicals to damage river flow, which affects a broader ecosystem than the place that they occupy, not to mention the human rights impact of what they do. So all of those are very live issues. And I think one of the speakers before me talked about the deforestation laws that were imported by the EU. I'd urge you to think one step sort of above that, which is the evolution and the arrival of CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism in the EU. My understanding is that by January 2026, so literally in about 18 months, there will be automatic requirements for imports coming into Europe from wherever else in the world they come in from, but crucially soy, beef, and perhaps even gold coming in from certain parts of the world where there has been infractions in indigenous land, where there's evidence of biodiversity loss as a result of their manufacture. Those goods will be stopped at the border. There's no doubt in my mind that what that will mean is that you're going to get a very strong bifurcation in the business models that are allowed to thrive via international trade. So if you're looking for the opportunities, the core opportunity is to find sustainable businesses in sustainable areas that are not based on deforestation or environmental damage, because those businesses will do better. They will have greater access to trade around the world. They will have goods and products and services that are respected. Those that don't will be and should be blocked. So we should see stranded assets in dangerous, damaging business models. So to speak to your question about where the opportunities are in sustainable businesses that don't damage the environment. And the only way you make that work properly is by enforcing a polluter pays principle that punishes businesses that do the opposite. I hope that helps.
Thanks so much, Chidi. We are at the time of closing this webinar, but our speakers to speak to new models have very graciously agreed to stay on because we've too ambitiously included too many topics here, which in future I know will break down into further deep dives, so we can explore some of these really critical issues with more of you being able to speak. But I do want to hand to Harvey Locke, who's raised his hand. Could you please keep it brief, but we'd love to hear from you. Harvey, could you explain who you are too?
Yes, I'm a nature person. I was involved, I'm the lead author of the paper that defined the nature positive idea. So what I'm interested in is the conversation that was just being tickled at a moment ago. Ecocide is clearly what you might call a stick, a red line, a boundary that you shouldn't cross. On the other hand, we need incentives. And one of the perverse things we have right now in global finance is that there are incentives to plant trees, but they're not incentives to protect standing forests or standing intact ecosystems, unless there's additionality through the climate side. And it feels to me that this conversation and others need to be looking at what's the creative space that incentivizes private investment in keeping things intact. Yes, ecocide's the stick, but where's the carrot? How do we create the carrot? And I don't know if Dr. Obihara would like to speak to that or anyone else, but this is my preoccupation.
Thank you very much for that.
Briefly, if you would.
I'll be as brief as I possibly can. Thanks. Thank you very much for that really excellent question, Dr. Locke. You're absolutely right. Primary old growth deforestation is where the problem is. And there are two ways, if you like, that the financial community, in terms of its disclosures, is looking at. And one way, SBTI have a flag, forestry, land, and agriculture, science-based outline as to how you transition away from business models that damage pre-existing forests. And so transition is being encouraged, transition is being talked about. people walking away from, excessive timber extraction models that take away old growth. That's one indicator. The second indicator around it is, unfortunately, goes back to the issue of measurement and campaigning and activism, which Jordan pointed to, which is to say that, remove of old growth and incredibly poor uses of things like biomass energy, which destroys old growth in a non-sustainable way, stating outright that 12% of humanity's carbon footprint comes from destruction of old growth, and campaigning against it, stating very, very clearly that this isn't a question of business models, this is a question of survival, that we cannot carry on hacking away at the lungs of the world and hope to survive.
Thanks, Judy. And also there are a number of initiatives looking at precisely this issue: the Forest Climate Leaders Partnership, government-to-government engagement, how to reward countries for their standing forests. And we're involved as well with a number of initiatives really looking at this issue because it's critical. Thanks so much for pointing that out, Harvey, appreciated. I now want to move to Atosa Soltani, who's Director of Global Strategy for the Amazon Sacred Headwaters Initiative, to tell us about the model, the collective vision and the approach that you are taking to the governance of forest and ecosystem in the Amazon basin. Atosa.
Thank you, Fiona. Hello, everybody. I'll try to be coherent. I'm in Singapore where it's after midnight. But I'm really happy to be here. A lot of the issues you touched on is exactly what we've been working on. I work closely with Domingo and indigenous peoples in the headwaters region of Ecuador and Peru, where 30 indigenous nations have come together around the shared vision of protecting their remaining forests, standing forests, and transitioning their economic model to an economy that is basically aligned with life flourishing in this most biodiverse part of our planet and a vital organ of the biosphere. I just want to say that the reason indigenous peoples in this area are united is because they've actually been effective of holding back a lot of the destruction for decades, and they are the landowners. They're the majority landowners in an area the size of Italy, where they have some level of autonomy and are working to model what is the next economy, that's aligned with their ancient values of harmony with life. And so here we are working on everything from macroeconomic policy instruments and macroeconomic, models of changing, for example, the extractive economy promoted by the governments of this region, which is very much short term and mostly is in part driven by external debt payments and the pressure by these governments to keep their countries, solvent, and basically mortgaging the Amazon rainforest, the most biologically productive system on Earth, for commodities markets in order to basically pay the interest on debt that is never payable. So one of the systemic solutions we need is to really rethink how biodiverse countries are able to align their goal of economic and governance with life flourishing. And there's these hot spots of biological productivity on the planet that are important for the whole planet. The Amazon is a vital organ, and it's reaching a tipping point. Speaking to what Marcelo mentioned and Domingo mentioned, is urgent that we avoid the tipping point of no return, because there's really no climate solution. There's no life on Earth possible without the tropical rainforests, and they're in trouble. And so part of what we are working on is pushing the governments on things like debt relief tied to conservation commitments, stopping the extraction of additional resources we don't need, like fossil fuels, and commitments to leave fossil fuels on the ground, commitments to restoration of large landscapes, connectivity, and commitment to permanent protection of every acre of forest that remains. So those are advocacy goals or public policies, but they're also indigenous people's own commitments to administer those things in their own territories. And for that, they've created a bioregional plan that really articulates well this multi-pronged holistic plan for permanent protection of these vital organs. We're also looking at the fact that, there needs to be, here in a country that adopted the rights of nature, that there needs to be basically enforcement, and that enforcement around rights of nature, like Domingo spoke to, is lacking. So we have to train judges, we have to bring cases, we have to set new norms, create new normals. Part of what Ecocide is exciting is because it's making it, even the idea that destroying nature is a crime is creating new values, new norms, publicly held in the court of public opinion first, and hopefully eventually in the court of law, that is basically articulating in the way that's it's akin to the analogy of slavery. We once allowed slavery. We once allowed dominion of other humans. We're now saying slavery is, normatively illegal and ethically wrong, in the same way nature's rights and nature's continued existence needs to be respected. And in that sense, when we're also, the Sacred Headwaters is looking at frameworks for financial incentives that reward standing forest, exactly like what Harvey said. People who are protecting the most important intact ecosystems don't qualify for financial incentives that promise additionality because they're actually doing a great job. In that sense, we need basically support for new frameworks that value standing forests and intact ecosystems, and really redefine at a country level, but also at the corporate level, true wealth as defined by, basically ecological flourishing, biological productivity, and standing ecosystems. So we have to transform this life-blind economic system to one that's life-seeing. And I know I'm kind of coming to the close of what I would say, but I totally agree that we need to also push for deforestation-free investment portfolios everywhere. And we've been campaigning on getting banks to stop financing mining and oil and other extractive cattle ranching. And that's a campaign that's happening at the campaigner level, but it needs to become public policy. And even as we strive to create models for basically financial incentives, we also need to be careful of financial incentives that allow the commons to become assets held privately away from the commons on some corporation's balance sheet or BlackRock's balance sheet. While we want incentives, we're in this riddle, finding financial incentives that serve life and serve nature flourishing, as opposed to nature serving the financial systems. So it's just basically an inversion of values. And last, I would say that we need leadership. Companies like Patagonia saying all of their profits are going to benefit the ecosystems in which they work and the communities in which they operate. We need to put the living entities like watersheds on the board of directors of corporations. We need to look at, applauding the leaders and in really exposing the laggards. And that needs to be activism. There's no time to waste. We need corporate actors who are advocates and primarily campaigning on a shift in the value system that ultimately we banned slavery. We made humans autonomous beings who lend their labor. So let's not now try to own forests as an asset that generates, economic returns for investors. Let's treat them as entities, living entities. And it all comes back to what Domingo said. Nature is alive, is a subject of rights, it's a subject of being, and our relationship with nature is where we really need to transform. So thank you for this opportunity. There's much more I wanted to say, and it's a little late, so I just stop there and say, check out the sacredheadwaters.org and let us know if you have ideas for us in how we create this model in the most biologically productive place on Earth.
Thank you so much, Atosa. We will certainly come back to you. We want to run a further deep dive into exactly what you're proposing and how do we make the rights of nature a reality and exert finance levers towards that effect. and have finance in service of nature, not the other way around. Thank you for staying on, everybody, and thank you so much, Atosa, for staying up way late. I want to hand to Josh Oxby now. Thanks for waiting, Josh. We're really interested in listening to your perspectives as a UN youth leader on what should the model be going forward, and how can young people and the groups that you're involved with drive it? Over to you.
Thank you very much, and thanks to the remaining panel and those audience members for sticking with us right to the end. So for a bit of background, I'm here today as a representative of those global young people calling for formal and justiciable ecocide reform. But let me be clear, in no way am I claiming to be a legal or financial expert. My actual expertise is in energy labour force transitions. So while of course there's an obvious, well, perhaps more distant overlap with my own insights, you'd all be quite right in wondering what's the value of this not so young youth advisor sort of being here today. Well, the wonderful thing about the whole youth movement is that we don't need to be a highly specialised expert in international criminal law to know that ecocide is a highly well-known, well-documented and mostly important, easily avoidable atrocity. In fact, in these sorts of instances, it actually pays to be a jack of all trades, as we're reliant upon those unique and reflexive insights from our constituency members to ensure that no matter who is speaking on our behalf, they're able to reflect the voices and opinions of the many, and not merely of the few. But what exactly are some of these unique ecocide perspectives that we as youth delegates and advisors are discussing, and sort of when we're transitioning to less harmful finance and business models? So for the sake of time, sort of as I know we're running way over, I'll cut straight to the point. In the same vein that I'm not here today to reinvent the wheel or simply argue that ecocide should be justiciable, as frankly, we as youth are tired of just stating the obvious again and again and again. Well, so too are these sort of unique and innovative perspectives that we need to be considering. Sort of as the remainder of the panel have already noted today, sort of we have the knowledge, we already have this basis. We just need to act upon it now. So this isn't radical thinking or anything brand new that I'll be presenting. So fundamentally, when we're approaching financial and business reforms, we believe that our overarching guiding principle has to be that of ensuring people and place are at the heart of all of our interventions. As would be the case with a hard transition from hydrocarbons, say, to renewable energy, while technically possible, sort of overnight, the socioeconomic and intergenerational impacts would be absolutely catastrophic, and we'd see global economies collapse, some instantaneously and some gradually over time. And there would be social upheaval and the demand for more realistic, less radical transitions. So if we were to strip right back to the core financial mechanisms that we could implement to prevent and hold to account those companies and state actors responsible for environmental exploitation, as Chidi's previously noted and other panelists, so we'd be quite right to propose targeted taxation interventions, i.e. additional taxes or blanket sort of exclusion from corporate capital allowances, voluntary and explicit reparation funds for those environments and peoples most impacted by degeneration, an enforced and monitored ecosystem service credits-based system, limiting the extent of actor interactions and environmental degradation, dedicated and specific fines to firms and actors knowingly contributing to the Earth system destruction. And of course, it goes without saying in an Ecocide webinar, legislative reforms, so actually holding these people to account, limiting license procurement and preventing ecocide in the first instance. In such a case, we'd be faced with a situation whereby these preventative measures could simply become an additional corporate budget line within delinquent companies and any expense to be borne as opposed to a deterrent. But none of this, as we pointed out today, is blue sky thinking. If we want to ensure meaningful, intergenerationally sustainable and attainable success, we need to ensure that these are done in a just and inclusive and fundamentally staggered manner. As Jojo so eloquently put earlier, at the end of the day, the default in our current capitalist society is that money and subsidies flow into a business as usual operations. Therefore, as our economy fully transitions to an environmentally extractive, from an environmentally extractive based model to an environmentally sustainable model, we are reluctantly aware that, at least in the short term, we will have to be dependent upon the support of our current global economic buttresses, i.e. actors responsible for known environmental degradation, if we want to ensure long-term, sustainable and successful transitions. So to quickly wrap up my intervention here today, in the same way that it's incredibly difficult to argue against formal legislative recognition of ecocide, so too is it near impossible to argue in favour of a complete and immediate global economic reform. Thus is the value of an overlap of ecocide accountability in this sort of grounded perspective. Well, of course, there are immediate actions we can consider, and as youth we are discussing in this sphere and beyond. Ultimately, when we're approaching these issues from a financial perspective, there's no silver bullet sort of how we're going to do this. Of course, while there's ways and an array of tools, as I've discussed, available at our disposal right now, these may actually restrict or inhibit capital investment in technology that may be beneficial to the environment in the long run. In essence, a great deal more investigation is fundamentally required, and dialogue sessions such as the ones we're hosting here today are crucial to highlighting these core issues, because make no mistake, time is not on our side, people. As youth, we cannot stress enough that with each day that passes, our window of opportunity to intervene lessens and lessens. And frankly, we ought to have acted yesterday. But at this stage, we can't be reactionary. We need to strike the right balance, else the socio-economic and intergenerational consequences will be catastrophic. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Josh. That was incredibly powerful call to action. And you've given us some really rich content to explore further, which we must do urgently. And we do need this out-of-the-box thinking. So we really want to invite, yourself, Atosa, other speakers on this call to really crunch through some of these issues and come up with some of the solutions. We're way over time. Apologies. Thanks so much to everyone who stayed on. I think this is actually a tribute to how important the topic is and the expertise in this room that's with us. So without further ado, I just want to hand to Jojo, who will do a short wrap up. And thank you, everybody, for contributing and building a sense of direction and expertise on these matters. Jojo.
Thank you, Fiona. What an incredibly rich discussion. I'll just try and finish with some points that have come up during that conversation. So the first one is that in the light of what we've heard, it feels to me like ecocide law could be conceptualized, and you did mention this briefly, Fiona, as a kind of a container, because we have all of these different frameworks coming in, we have different sort of incentivization measures being discussed, and all of these different aspects. But what ecocide law could do is create this kind of floor level, which is what Chidi was describing, below which it's not okay to go, and that in a sense it allows for the kind of completion of a picture where there are maybe many gaps, lots of specific things maybe being addressed, but actually when all of that doesn't work, or when people just don't care, of which unfortunately there are a number of actors, then having this as a floor is very important. The second thing that's really emerged as well is the advocacy point, and I think it's worth mentioning how important and how powerful that is. I mean, just as an example, giving our organization as an example, a few years ago, this conversation was not live in any government. What the kind of driving of this conversation has done, while by no means down exclusively to us, making those kind of conversations and connections has enabled this conversation to move very, very fast, to become, a really key one that's being discussed by dozens of governments and indeed regions, for example, in the EU. And it represents, as Atosa was saying, the potential of inserting something into an existing system with relative simplicity, but that has the potential to really start shifting that mindset, to start shifting those values. When we put destruction of nature next to destruction of people in terms of how serious it is, that really starts to shift that balance. And then lastly, which is interesting, people do, of course, see criminal law as a stick. I would like to say that what is also so inspiring and useful about ecocide law, and particularly the international definition, which has gained so much traction, is that it works very, very well as a framing tool. And for people who know their sectors, it's, it's like, they may not have had specific questions in their minds, but they certainly will have as soon as they read that definition. And that is absolutely key, because when we start asking the questions that need to be asked, what does our sector need to do to fit it, to be able to comply with this approaching law? We have that kind of strategic window. As Josh said, it cannot be done overnight. It should not be done overnight. But we also can't wait too long. And having that window of time to go, right, where do we need to steer? And this framework will help me. That is a really positive thing. That is not something to be afraid of. That is something to really grab hold of and use for asking the right questions. And finally, I think, again, this has come through from everyone, really, I suppose, is the urgency of this. And actually how useful and important and crucial it is to have the criminal law aspect in place, particularly when we're seeing the insanity of some of the decisions that are being made, like, for example, yesterday's in Brazil, where actually, the power is being taken away from those ministries that should be being able to support demarcation of indigenous territories, protection of, the Amazon rainforest. Effectively, when we introduce internationally, and again, this was something that Kat brought up, when we introduce internationally an outer guardrail, what we are doing is providing a really crucial tool for places where the government's decisions may not be going in the direction that is healthy. And of course, as we transition away from fossil fuels and we move into, an economy that is powered by electricity and digitization, we're also looking at, rare minerals that are also located in fragile ecosystems. And so it's going to be absolutely key that this is not just about decarbonization. This is about putting in place basic protection for all ecosystems so that as we transition, we don't step from the frying pan into the fire. And I think this is a really sort of crucial issue that comes up when we're talking about transition. So I'm going to wrap up there, but thank you so much, everybody, for contributing to this. Thank you, Fiona, for incredible moderation, and thanks for staying with us. There will be a recording which will be, tidied up and edited so that you don't see all the sort of, tech and audio issues we had at the beginning and all of that. And of course, it will go out publicly, and it will go to those who attended this session. So once again, if you don't want to be in that, let us know. Otherwise, that will be readily and very soon available. Thank you to everyone.